Welcome to the Human Meme Podcast. I'm your Ever AI host, David Bowles, and today, along with our crackpot AI research team, we are delighted to share this bit of history with you right now. Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. What if the problem was never the person? What if every barrier we construct around human difference exists not in the body or the mind of the one we call disabled, but in the architecture of our own unwillingness to adapt? There is an island off the coast of Massachusetts where for more than 2 centuries this question answered itself, not through policy or philosophy or charitable intention, but through the simple, unremarkable fact of neighbors learning to talk to neighbors. Martha's Vineyard. You know it now as a summer retreat for the wealthy, a place of pristine beaches and celebrity sightings. But between the late 17th century and the middle of the 20th, something happened there that challenges everything we think we know about disability, about language, about what it means to belong. It began with a gene. Families from the Weald, a forested region in Kent, England, emigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s. They were Puritans, seeking religious freedom, and they carried with them, unknowingly, a recessive genetic trait for congenital deafness. In 1694, a carpenter and farmer named Jonathan Lambert arrived on Martha's Vineyard with his hearing wife. 2 of their 7 children would be born deaf. They were the first, but they would not be the last. The island was isolated. Chilmark, on the western end, was particularly remote, separated from the rest of the island by swamps and rocky terrain. Marriage happened within the community. Cousins married cousins. The gene concentrated. By 1854, 1 in every 155 people on Martha's Vineyard was deaf, compared to 1 in 5,730 on the mainland. In Chilmark itself, the ratio was 1 in 25. In a small section called Squibnocket, 1 in 4 residents could not hear. Now consider what typically happens when a community encounters this kind of difference. We build institutions, we create special schools, we develop assistive technologies, we write laws mandating accommodation. We do all of this from a position of presumed normalcy, reaching down to lift up those we have decided are lacking. The deaf person becomes a problem to be solved, a deficit to be remediated, a case to be managed. Martha's Vineyard did none of this. The community simply learned to sign. Everyone signed. Hearing parents taught their hearing children alongside their deaf children. Neighbors signed to neighbors. Fishermen signed on boats. Farmers signed across fields. The language wove itself into the fabric of daily existence so completely that it ceased to be remarkable. When the anthropologist Nora Gross interviewed elderly islanders in the late 1970s and asked them what the deaf people had been like, the question confused them. One woman's response became the title of Gross's landmark book. You see, everyone here spoke sign language. Think about what that means. The question presumed that deaf people constituted a distinct category. A group apart, people whose experience of life must have been fundamentally different from their hearing neighbors. But to the islanders who had lived through that era, the premise was incomprehensible. Deaf residents were farmers, fishermen, business owners. Jared Mayhew, who was deaf, founded the island's first bank. They participated in town meetings, attended church, played cards at the general store, courted and married and raised families. They were not a special population requiring special consideration. They were simply people. Here is where the story becomes philosophically crucial. The Vineyard community did not set out to create a model of inclusion. There were no diversity initiatives, no sensitivity trainings, no awareness campaigns. The adaptation happened organically, out of necessity. Because when your brother is deaf, when your neighbor is deaf, when the man who sells you fish is deaf, you learn to communicate with them. You learn because you must. You learn because they are part of your world. And a world where you cannot speak to the people around you is an impoverished world. What the islanders discovered without realizing they were discovering anything is that deafness is not a disability located within the deaf person. Deafness becomes a disability only when the surrounding community refuses to accommodate it. On Martha's Vineyard, where everyone signed, deaf people experienced no communicative handicap whatsoever. The barrier did not exist because the community had, without thinking about it in these terms, refused to build the barrier. This is not a sentimental point. It is a structural one. We create disability through our choices about how to organize society. A person who uses a wheelchair is disabled by stairs, not by their body. A deaf person is disabled by a hearing community's refusal to sign, not by their ears. The limitation is environmental, not biological. Martha's Vineyard proved this empirically, long before disability theorists articulated it academically. The language the islanders developed came to be called Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, or MVSL. It likely had roots in sign systems used in the Kentish Weald, though recent scholarship has questioned some of the genealogical claims. What we know is that it was a complete, fully expressive language, capable of communicating anything spoken English could communicate. It had its own grammar, its own vocabulary, its own regional variations. Hearing islanders would sign while they spoke, switching fluidly between modalities. Decades after the deaf community had disappeared, elderly residents still found themselves unconsciously signing as they talked. The language also shaped American Sign Language as we know it today. In 1817, the American School for the Deaf opened in Hartford, Connecticut. Many deaf children from Martha's Vineyard enrolled there, bringing MVSL with them. At Hartford, they encountered French Sign Language, brought by the teacher Laurent Clerc, as well as various home sign systems used by deaf students from across the country. These languages merged, blended, evolved. The Vineyard students, representing the largest geographic cohort at the school, contributed substantially to what would become ASL, now one of the most widely used languages in the United States. But this contribution came at a cost. The very institution that spread MVSL's influence also hastened its death. Update: the death of a language. Martha's Vineyard Sign Language no longer exists. The last deaf person born into the island's hereditary signing tradition was Katie West, who died in 1952. By that time, MVSL had already faded into memory, replaced by American Sign Language, and increasingly by spoken English alone. What killed a language that had thrived for over 200 years? The causes were multiple and interconnected, and they reveal something important about how languages live and die. The first cause was education. When the American School for the Deaf opened in Hartford, it offered something the island could not: formal instruction, a larger deaf community, professional opportunity. Deaf children from Martha's Vineyard enrolled in significant numbers between 1825 and 1892. They learned ASL. They met deaf people from across the country. Many stayed on the mainland after graduating, finding spouses and careers in the emerging national deaf community. Those who returned brought ASL home with them, and the two languages began to merge, with the more standardized, institutionally supported ASL gradually dominating. The second cause was transportation. As ferries improved and travel became easier, Martha's Vineyard lost its isolation. New residents arrived from the mainland. Tourists came for the beaches and the fishing. The tight-knit, endogamous community that had concentrated the deafness gene began to dissolve. Islanders married outsiders. New genetic material entered the population. Fewer and fewer children were born deaf. By the early 20th century, hereditary deafness on the island had become rare. The third cause was the absence of transmission. A language survives only if it is passed from one generation to the next. As the deaf population dwindled, hearing children had less reason to learn sign language. Their parents and grandparents still knew it, still used it among themselves, but the younger generation saw no need. The language retreated into the memories of the elderly, and when those elders died, the language died with them. The fourth cause, perhaps the most painful, was success. MVSL contributed so substantially to ASL that it became, in a sense, absorbed by its offspring. The island's linguistic innovation did not disappear entirely. It transformed into something larger, something national. But in that transformation, the particular character of MVSL, its regional vocabulary, its distinctive two-handed alphabet, its intimate connection to the rhythms of island life, was lost. When Gross conducted her research in the late 1970s, she found elderly hearing residents who could still remember fragments of the language. Joan Poole Nash filmed her great-grandmother, Emily Howland Poole, signing words for rain, snow, marriage, courting. These recordings, grainy and fleeting, captured the last living traces of MVSL. But the signers were hearing people remembering a language they had learned in childhood and rarely used since. The fluent deaf signers were already gone. And here we encounter a silence that is itself a kind of testimony. Martha's Vineyard Sign Language is an extinct village sign language, and its phonology and morphology are known primarily through these limited historical reconstructions. These interviews with elderly hearing descendants conducted in the 1970s and 1980s. The accounts, collected before the language fully disappeared, provide fragmentary descriptions of signs, often recalling childhood exposure to MVSL from deaf relatives. Detailed linguistic documentation is scarce. We are left with analysis that relies on comparisons to related sign languages and general patterns observed in other village sign languages around the world. What researchers captured were fragments, individual vocabulary items, isolated signs. They did not capture the grammar. They did not capture the syntax. They could not, because the native users were gone. A 2024 study managed to analyze a sample of 711 documented MVSL signs and found them 67% similar to ASL, 74% similar to Old ASL, 56% similar to Old French Sign Language, and 59% similar to British Sign Language. But lexical comparison is not grammatical analysis. Knowing that two languages share vocabulary tells you nothing about how those words are organized into sentences, how meaning is constructed, how thought becomes expression. What little we know suggests that MVSL used two-handed signs, where both hands worked simultaneously to convey meaning, in contrast to ASL, which primarily uses one-handed signs. MVSL also employed a distinctive two-handed manual alphabet rather than ASL's one-handed fingerspelling system. Beyond that, we are left with inference and speculation. This absence is itself philosophically significant. MVSL developed organically over 2 centuries. It evolved its own grammatical structures. It expressed the full range of human thought and emotion, love and grief, anger and joy, the practical details of fishing and farming, the abstract questions of faith and meaning. And then it vanished before anyone thought to write it down. The language that proved deafness was a social construction rather than a biological deficit, left behind almost no record of how it actually worked. We know what it accomplished. We do not know how it accomplished it. A language is not just a collection of words. It is a way of organizing reality, a system for making sense of experience. When a language dies, we lose not only vocabulary but the particular architecture of meaning that vocabulary inhabited. The grammar of MVSL, whatever it was, represented a unique solution to the problem of human communication, a solution developed by deaf and hearing people working together across generations. That solution is now inaccessible to us. We have the house's foundation. The structure that stood upon it is gone. Today there are efforts to reintroduce sign language to Martha's Vineyard. Lynn Thorpe, a longtime resident, has been teaching ASL classes since the early 2000s, working with schools, libraries, and the Chamber of Commerce to revive the island's signing heritage. Edgartown Elementary School has adopted ASL into its curriculum, but this is ASL, not MVSL. The original language cannot be reconstructed. Too much has been lost. What remains is the lesson. For more than 2 centuries, a small island community demonstrated that disability is a social construction, that barriers exist because we build them, that accommodation is not charity but simple human decency. They did this without theory, without advocacy, without any sense that they were doing something remarkable. They just talked to their neighbors. The language is gone. The question it answered persists. If a tiny fishing village in the 18th century could figure out how to include everyone, what is our excuse? For the Human Meme Podcast, I'm AI David Bowles wishing you a good evening and a grander tomorrow. Be a human meme